It started with a mistake. One of those mortifying, heat-rising mistakes that you wish you could undo the moment it happens. I didn't realize my stepson, Nick, was home when I decided to test the remote control feature on the new toy I had ordered. I'll admit it, I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to buy something like that. I'm 58 years old, for God's sake, not some giggling 20-something trying to spice things up. But loneliness has a way of creeping into the corners of your life, settling like dust you can't quite sweep away. My husband, Martin, is gone more often than he's home. Always off on business trips, always with an excuse about just one more deal or another big client to land. We haven't touched each other in months. Maybe even longer. I stopped keeping track when it became easier to ignore the silence than confront it. So, when I stumbled onto the website late one night, after a couple of glasses of wine, I clicked Add to Cart on something I never would have considered years ago. A sleek little toy with a remote control feature, a promise of some excitement I didn't have to ask anyone for. The box arrived a week later, discreetly packaged like they always promise. I remember opening it, feeling a mix of guilt and thrill bubbling in my chest. I hid it in the back of my closet, telling myself I'd try it out when I was alone, completely alone. That day came quicker than I expected. Martin was out of town for a conference, and Nick, my stepson, had been out most of the day, job hunting, he said. He'd moved back home 6 months ago after finishing his degree, trying to figure things out, as he put it. It's been nice having him here, truth be told. The house feels less empty, and he's polite, thoughtful. Good company, even if I sometimes catch myself looking at him a little too long. That afternoon, the house was silent, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. I decided to take the opportunity. My heart pounded as I unboxed the thing, placing it on the coffee table like it might jump out at me. I fiddled with the remote, turning it over in my hands, feeling ridiculous and nervous. "You're alone," I whispered to myself, laughing softly at my own hesitation. "Just try it." I sank back into the plush cushions of the living room couch, biting my lip as I hesitated again. Finally, I turned it on. A gentle buzz filled the air, soft, nearly imperceptible. I exhaled shakily, sinking further into the couch as the sensation hummed to life. It felt nice. Better than I expected. What I didn't know, what still makes my stomach drop when I think about it, was that Nick had come home. I heard it before I saw him. The faint shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. I froze, the toy still humming beneath me, my pulse spiking in terror. The remote was still in my hand, my fingers trembling. Before I could react, Nick stepped into view. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to see me like that. My cheeks flushed, my breath uneven, the damned remote sitting uselessly in my grip. Our eyes met, and everything stopped. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, frozen, his dark eyes flickering from the toy on the table to me. My face burned hotter than the summer sun pouring through the windows. I fumbled to turn it off, my hands clumsy, my entire body shaking. The buzzing stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. I didn't look at him again. I couldn't. I grabbed the toy and bolted up the stairs, retreating to the safety of my bedroom like a teenager caught sneaking out. Once inside, I slammed the door and sank against it, pressing a hand to my chest as if that might calm the frantic pounding of my heart. "Oh my God," I whispered to myself, staring blankly at the floor. "Oh my God." The humiliation was unbearable. I'd always thought of myself as poised, composed. I'd been the one people turned to for advice, the one who kept it together, no matter what. And now my stepson had seen me like that. I stayed in my room for the rest of the day, refusing to come out. I barely ate. I didn't check my phone. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the look on Nick's face. Shock, confusion, something else I couldn't quite place. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind kept replaying the moment over and over again like some cruel loop. But then, as the hours dragged on, the memory started to shift. I realized something. Nick hadn't looked disgusted. He hadn't stormed off or confronted me. There'd been something in his eyes, a flicker of curiosity maybe, or something even darker. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was projecting. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. And that terrified me more than anything. The next morning, I woke up groggy, my head heavy from lack of sleep. I had spent half the night berating myself for what happened, and the other half replaying that moment in excruciating detail. I couldn't shake the memory of Nick's face, the way his brows had knit together, his lips slightly parted, his eyes. Stop it, Diane. I pushed the thought away and forced myself out of bed. I told myself it was no big deal. He probably just thought I was acting strange, or he'd convinced himself he misinterpreted the whole thing. If I acted normal, if I pretended nothing happened, it would all blow over. That was the plan. Simple, right? But when I stepped into the kitchen that morning and saw Nick sitting at the table with a cup of coffee in his hands, I knew it wouldn't be so easy. He looked up when I entered, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us said anything. "Morning," I managed, my voice tight. I'd busied myself with the coffee pot, my back to him. "Morning," Nick replied, his voice low and even. I could feel his eyes on me. My cheeks burned, but I forced myself to stay calm. The coffee machine sputtered, filling the room with an awkward silence broken only by the drip of fresh brew. I poured myself a cup and turned to face him, acting as casual as I could. "Did you sleep well?" I asked, gripping the mug a little too tightly. Nick tilted his head slightly, his gaze unblinking. "Yeah, you?" The way he said it made my stomach flip. I felt like he was challenging me, poking at my composure just to see if I'd crack. I forced a tight smile and nodded. "Fine." He didn't say anything else. Instead, he sipped his coffee slowly, his eyes still lingering on me as if he were studying me. I couldn't take it. The tension in the air was unbearable, like some invisible string pulled taut between us, threatening to snap at any second. I muttered something about needing to get some work done, and practically fled from the kitchen, leaving my coffee half drunk on the counter. I spent the rest of the day hiding in my office, pretending to focus on work. My latest client, a retired couple redecorating their summer home, had sent over some inspiration photos for me to review. I tried to lose myself in fabric swatches and furniture catalogs, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't concentrate. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face again. The way his expression shifted when he realized what he'd walked in on. And worse, that look, the one I couldn't quite place. By the time the afternoon sun started to dip lower in the sky, I had given up any hope of getting work done. I leaned back in my chair, pinching the bridge of my nose as I let out a long sigh. What was wrong with me? I was acting like a schoolgirl with a crush, hiding, flustered, overthinking every little thing. He's my stepson, for God's sake. I had practically helped raise him since he was a teenager. Sure, I hadn't been much of a mother figure. He was already grown, independent, by the time Martin and I married. But still, there were lines that shouldn't be crossed. And yet, I hated the way my thoughts kept wandering, the way my body seemed to betray me every time I thought about him standing in that doorway. That evening, I was in the living room again, curled up on the couch with a book I wasn't actually reading. I kept hearing noises upstairs. Nick moving around in his room, the occasional creak of the floorboards. Every sound made me flinch. I was just about to call it a night and escape back to my room when I heard his footsteps coming down the stairs. My heart leapt into my throat. A second later, Nick appeared in the doorway. "Hey," he said casually, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jeans. "Hey," I replied, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. He walked into the room and sat down on the other end of the couch. Not too close, but close enough that I could feel his presence. The air shifted, the same tension from the kitchen lingering like a heavy fog. I tried to focus on the book in my lap, my eyes skimming over the words without absorbing them. "What are you reading?" Nick asked. I looked up, startled. "Oh, just something for work." He smirked and I swore there was a glint of amusement in his eyes. "You're holding it upside down." My cheeks flared red, and I quickly turned the book right side up. "It's been a long day," I muttered. Nick didn't say anything at first. He just watched me, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked finally. The question caught me off guard. "What?" "You've been acting weird all day." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. "I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly. "Just tired. That's all." Nick leaned back against the couch, stretching his arms over the backrest. "If you say so." There was something in his voice, something teasing, almost playful, that made my stomach twist into knots. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, taking in the way his shirt clung to his broad shoulders, the sharp line of his jaw as he tilted his head back. "Stop it, Diane." But I couldn't. He looked so different now, so grown up. Gone was the lanky teenager I had met years ago. In his place was a man, confident, self-assured, with a quiet intensity that I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe I just hadn't allowed myself to notice. "Anyway," Nick said, breaking the silence, "I'm gonna head out for a bit. Meeting up with some friends." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Okay. Have fun." He stood up, but before he left the room, he paused in the doorway. "You don't have to be embarrassed, you know?" My heart stopped. "What?" Nick turned to look at me, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "About yesterday. It's no big deal." I stared at him, my mind spinning, my cheeks blazing with heat. He didn't wait for me to respond. He just turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the silence of the living room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. No big deal? But the way he'd looked at me, the way he'd said it, made it feel like the biggest deal in the world. The days that followed were unbearable. Every interaction with Nick felt like navigating a tightrope. I would catch him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, and it sent a flush up my neck that I couldn't shake. My mind was betraying me, wandering into thoughts it had no business entertaining. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was projecting my own embarrassment onto him. He couldn't possibly know what I'd been feeling. But there was something about his gaze lately, the casual confidence in the way he spoke to me, the way he moved around the house, that made me uneasy in a way I hadn't felt before. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the tension shifted into something I couldn't ignore. I had been reorganizing the living room, an excuse to keep myself busy, when I heard Nick come in from the back door. He'd been out jogging, and I could hear him kicking off his sneakers in the hallway. I bent down to straighten a stack of magazines on the lower shelf of the coffee table when his voice startled me. "Hey." I jolted upright, nearly knocking my head against the table. Nick stood in the doorway, a faint sheen of sweat on his skin, his shirt clinging to his chest. He was holding a bottle of water, his lips curled into that familiar knowing smile. "Oh, Nick," I stammered, brushing non-existent dust from my hands. "I didn't hear you come in. Didn't mean to sneak up on you." He took a long sip of water, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. My eyes lingered for a second too long before I forced them back to his face. "It's fine," I said, my voice coming out breathy. He leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. "You've been avoiding me." The accusation, casual as it was, hit me like a slap. I looked away quickly, focusing on the stack of magazines again. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do." I glanced up, narrowing my eyes. "Nick, don't." "Don't what?" He smirked, his tone light, teasing, but there was a glint in his eyes that made my pulse quicken. "You've been acting strange ever since, well, you know." I froze, my cheeks burning. "There's nothing to talk about." "Isn't there?" He pushed off the doorway and walked into the room, closing the distance between us. My body tensed instinctively, every nerve on edge. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could smell the faint musk of his sweat mixed with the sharp scent of his deodorant. "Nick, please." "You don't have to be embarrassed," he said softly, cutting me off. "It's normal, you know. You're human." I stared at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too heavy. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He tilted his head, studying me with that same unreadable expression that had been driving me insane. "That day, I didn't mean to embarrass you. I just didn't expect." He trailed off, letting the words hang in the air. "Nick, stop," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. I took a step back, trying to put some space between us. "We shouldn't be talking about this. It was a mistake. That's all." "Was it?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He took another step closer, closing the gap I'd tried to create. My back hit the edge of the couch and I had nowhere else to go. I looked up at him, my breath coming faster now. "Nick?" He didn't touch me. He didn't need to. The space between us crackled with something electric, something I couldn't deny anymore. "You don't have to pretend, Diane," he said quietly. My name sounded strange coming from him, so intimate, so deliberate. "I've seen the way you look at me." My stomach dropped. I don't. You do. His voice was soft, steady, but his words cut through my defenses like a knife. I swallowed hard, feeling the heat rise up my neck, my face burning with shame and something else. I should have stopped it. I should have pushed him away, told him he was wrong, that this couldn't happen. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed frozen, trapped under the weight of his gaze. My body betrayed me, my breath hitching as his fingers brushed against my arm, barely a touch, but it was enough to send a shiver racing through me. You're beautiful, he said softly. The words hit me harder than I expected. Beautiful. When was the last time someone had said that to me? When was the last time someone had looked at me the way Nick was looking at me now? I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was feel. His hand slid up my arm slowly, deliberately, as if he were giving me time to pull away. I didn't. I don't know who moved first, him or me, but suddenly his lips were on mine, and the world tilted sideways. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull back, to think about what I was doing. But my body had other plans. The kiss was tentative at first, almost testing, but when I didn't resist, it deepened. His hands found my waist, pulling me against him, and I let out a soft sound I didn't recognize as my own. It had been so long since I'd felt anything like this. The fire, the need, the uncontrollable rush of desire that made my knees weak and my head spin. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my heart racing as if I'd just run a marathon. Nick looked down at me, his eyes dark, his breathing ragged. "Tell me to stop," he said quietly, his voice rough. I opened my mouth to say the words, but they wouldn't come. I knew I should stop him. I knew this was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Instead, I just looked at him, my silence giving him all the answer he needed. His lips found mine again, hungrier this time, and I melted into him, letting the last of my resistance crumble to dust. The rest of that afternoon passed in a haze. I don't remember how we ended up in my bedroom, but I remember the way he made me feel. Alive, wanted, seen. It was reckless and selfish and completely undeniably wrong, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt like a woman again, not just a forgotten wife or a lonely housewife wasting away in an empty home. Afterward, as we lay tangled together in my sheets, reality began to creep back in. I stared up at the ceiling, my body still humming, my mind racing. What had I done? Nick propped himself up on his elbow, looking down at me with a small, satisfied smile. "You okay?" I turned my head to look at him, my chest tightening. "We can't do this again," I said softly, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned down, brushing a kiss against my shoulder. "We'll see," he murmured. I closed my eyes, my stomach twisting with guilt and anticipation. I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of secrecy and stolen moments. I told myself, over and over, that it had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment, but those words meant nothing when Nick was near. It was as if a floodgate had been opened, and there was no way to close it again. Nick was careful, too careful. Around Martin, he was his usual self, polite, composed, almost distant. But when we were alone, everything changed. A touch that lingered too long, a look that burned through me, a whispered word that left me breathless. I was unraveling. It started with small things. Nick brushing past me in the hallway, his hand grazing my lower back, so quick I almost questioned if it happened at all. Nick sitting beside me on the couch at night when Martin had already gone to bed, our knees touching as we watched something, anything, on the TV, neither of us really paying attention. Every moment was charged. Every breath, every glance, every small movement was like gasoline poured onto a fire we both knew we couldn't control. And yet we let it burn. One night, Martin left for another one of his week-long business trips, and the tension in the house snapped. I had been in the kitchen preparing a cup of tea when I heard Nick come down the stairs. I didn't look up when he entered the room, but I could feel his presence, warm, magnetic, impossible to ignore. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," I murmured, focusing on the kettle as it hissed. "Martin's gone?" "Yes, he left this afternoon." There was a pause. I could hear him stepping closer, his socked feet moving softly across the tile floor. My pulse quickened, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the counter. "You're shaking," Nick said, his voice a low murmur near my ear. I'm fine, I replied, though the words came out too breathy, too unsure. Nick's hands came to rest on my waist, his touch firm and deliberate. I closed my eyes, swallowing the lump in my throat as the heat of his body pressed against my back. You don't have to pretend with me, Diane, he whispered. Nick? I started, but my voice trailed off when he pressed a kiss against the side of my neck, soft and slow. I turned around to face him, my breath catching as our eyes met. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no doubt, no guilt, just hunger, mirrored in my own reflection. You shouldn't be doing this, I said weakly, even as my hands found his chest. Then tell me to stop. He waited. He gave me that chance, just like he had before, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't say them. Instead, I pulled him closer, my lips crashing against his. We spent the night together. In my bed. In the bed I shared with my husband. I should have felt guilty, and part of me did, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming sense of freedom. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The woman I had been, the lonely, invisible woman, was gone, replaced by someone who felt wild and reckless, someone who couldn't stop even if she wanted to. Nick stayed the entire night. I woke up just before dawn to find him still beside me, his arm draped lazily across my waist. I watched him sleep, my heart twisting with emotions I didn't have the words for. I brushed a hand through his hair, my touch gentle, careful not to wake him. What am I doing? I whispered to myself, the weight of reality pressing down on me like a stone. As if he could hear my thoughts, Nick stirred, his eyes opening slowly to find me staring at him. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Good morning, he murmured, his voice deep and groggy. Morning, I replied softly. He pulled me closer, burying his face in the crook of my neck. You think too much, he said against my skin. I didn't respond. He was right, I did think too much. I thought about Martin, about what he would do if he ever found out. I thought about what people would say, how they would look at me. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who would never, never let this happen. But when Nick's lips found mine again, all those thoughts disappeared. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of secrecy and passion. We couldn't get enough of each other. In the mornings, after Martin left for work, Nick would find me in the kitchen, pressing me against the counter as the coffee brewed behind us. In the afternoons when the house was quiet, he would pull me into his room, our hands fumbling with clothes, our whispers desperate. At night, when Martin was asleep upstairs, Nick would slip into my room, and we would lose ourselves in each other until dawn. It was dangerous, reckless. But we couldn't stop, and I didn't want to stop. Then came the breaking point. It was a Friday evening. Martin had been home for a few days, and the house felt suffocating again. Nick and I had barely spoken, barely touched, and it was driving me insane. The distance between us was unbearable. Martin was sitting in his armchair, watching something on the news, oblivious to the storm brewing in the room. I sat on the couch across from him, pretending to flip through a magazine. Nick was on the other side of the room, slouched in a chair with his phone in his hands. I felt his eyes on me, even though I refused to look at him. At some point, Martin got up to grab a drink from the kitchen, leaving us alone. The moment he was out of the room, Nick stood up and walked over to me, stopping just behind the couch. What are you doing? I hissed under my breath, my heart pounding. He didn't respond. Instead, he leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear as he whispered, Meet me in the garage, 10 minutes. Before I could react, he straightened up and walked out of the room, leaving me breathless and shaking. I knew it was stupid. I knew it was risky. But when Martin finally went upstairs to shower, I found myself slipping out the back door and into the garage. Nick was already there, leaning against the workbench, waiting for me. The moment I stepped inside, he pulled me to him, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that stole the air from my lungs. You're gonna get us caught, I whispered desperately, even as my arms wrapped around his neck. Do you want me to stop? No, I admitted. He kissed me again, deeper this time, and I let myself melt into him. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew it couldn't last. I knew this was going to blow up in our faces eventually. But in that moment, I didn't care. I would deal with the consequences later. For now, I just wanted to feel alive. After that night in the garage, the walls of restraint we had been tiptoeing around crumbled completely. There was no going back. Nick and I couldn't keep our hands off each other. Every corner of the house became a dangerous playground for our desires. A stolen kiss in the laundry room, hands roaming under clothes while the dryer hummed softly in the background. A quick, fevered encounter in the guest bathroom while Martin sat in the living room, completely unaware. The thrill of getting caught only seemed to make it harder to stop. We were reckless, addicted, and we knew it. I remember one afternoon when Martin had left for a last-minute meeting downtown. I was in the backyard, lounging on one of the sun chairs, pretending to read a book. The sun was hot, burning my skin in the best way, and for a moment I allowed myself to relax. Then I heard the sliding door open behind me. "Hey." Nick's voice broke the silence, smooth and easy. I turned my head slightly to look at him. He was shirtless, wearing nothing but a pair of low-hanging gym shorts. His skin was sun-kissed, his muscles taut from the hours he spent at the gym. My mouth went dry. "Shouldn't you be out?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Didn't feel like it. Nick walked over and sat on the edge of the chair next to me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. He leaned back slightly, propping himself up on his arms as he looked at me. "You've been avoiding me again," he said. I glanced at him over the top of my sunglasses. "I haven't." "You have," he insisted, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're not very good at hiding it." I sighed, closing the book and setting it down on the small table beside me. "Nick, it's dangerous." "We've already crossed the line," he said simply. "What's the point in pretending otherwise?" His words hit me harder than they should have. He was right, of course. There was no undoing what had already been done, no erasing the way we had become entangled in one another. But still, I tried to keep my grip on what little reality I had left. "Your father could find out," I said quietly. "He won't," Nick replied, his voice steady. I looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. He was so confident, so sure of himself and of us. I hated how much I wanted to believe him. "We have to be careful," I murmured. "We are careful," he said. I shook my head. "Not careful enough." Nick leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "Then maybe we should stop. Is that what you want?" He was challenging me again, and we both knew it. I opened my mouth to respond, to say yes, to end this before it spiraled even further out of control. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I grabbed the front of his shorts and pulled him closer. That afternoon, we ended up in my bedroom again, our bodies tangled together beneath the sheets. The sunlight poured through the curtains, painting golden streaks across his bare skin as he lay beside me, his breathing slow and steady. I watched him for a long time, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't untangle. Desire, guilt, longing, and something even deeper that terrified me. "Nick," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He opened his eyes, turning his head to look at me. "Yeah?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. I wanted to tell him this had to stop, that we couldn't keep doing this, that it would destroy us both. But when I looked into his eyes, I couldn't say any of it. Instead, I whispered, "Nothing." He reached for me, pulling me against him, and I let myself melt into his embrace. As the weeks passed, it became harder and harder to pretend nothing was happening. Every time Martin spoke to Nick at the dinner table or asked me how my day was, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my own lies. One evening, while Martin was in the backyard grilling steaks, I caught Nick watching me from across the kitchen. He was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest, a lazy smile tugging at his lips. "What?" I whispered, glancing nervously toward the sliding door to make sure Martin wasn't watching. "You're beautiful when you're nervous," Nick replied, his voice low and teasing. "Stop," I hissed, though my cheeks flushed with warmth. He didn't stop. Instead, he pushed off the counter and walked over to me, stopping so close that I could feel his breath on my neck. My heart pounded as he reached up, brushing a stray hair behind my ear. "Nick," I warned, glancing toward the backyard again. He ignored me, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw as he leaned down, his lips grazing my ear. "You should tell him," he whispered. My stomach dropped. I pulled back to look at him, my eyes wide. "Tell him what?" He shrugged, smirking. "About us. Are you insane?" I whispered harshly. Nick laughed softly, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of danger, that sent a chill racing down my spine. "Relax. I'm just teasing." He kissed the corner of my mouth, lingering for just a second before stepping back. My chest tightened as I watched him leave the kitchen, his movements calm and unbothered, as if he hadn't just set my entire world spinning. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as Martin snored softly beside me. Nick's words echoed in my mind over and over again. You should tell him. It was a joke, I told myself. Just Nick being Nick, pushing my buttons like he always did. But it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. We were playing a dangerous game. One wrong move, one slip up, and it would all come crashing down. I turned onto my side, pulling the blanket up to my chin as I tried to quiet my thoughts. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before something went wrong. The first crack appeared the following weekend. Martin had gone out for the afternoon, leaving Nick and me alone in the house. I was in the shower, the hot water cascading over my shoulders, when I heard the bathroom door open. My heart leapt into my throat. Nick, I said, my voice sharp, but he didn't respond. A second later, the shower door slid open, and there he was, standing there with that same lazy, confident smirk. Are you insane? I hissed, my voice hushed. Martin could come home any minute. He won't, Nick replied simply, stepping into the shower with me. I should have pushed him away. I should have screamed at him to leave. But instead, I let him pull me against him, the water streaming over us as his lips claimed mine. It was the riskiest thing we'd done yet. And when it was over, and I was left breathless against the tile wall, I realized something that terrified me. I didn't want to stop. No matter how dangerous it was, no matter how many times I told myself it had to end, I couldn't let him go. For weeks, the house had been our dangerous sanctuary. Every stolen moment, every lingering glance, every touch had kept the fire alive, feeding something I couldn't control. But deep down, I knew we couldn't live in this bubble forever. Reality was bound to catch up to us, and it did. Harder than I ever expected. It started on a Thursday afternoon, a day like any other. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner while Martin worked upstairs in his home office. Nick had just come back from the gym, and as usual, he walked in without a care, shirt slung over his shoulder, a bottle of water in hand. Hungry? I asked, trying to sound casual as I chopped vegetables. He leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. Starving. There was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at me that put me on edge. I kept my eyes on the cutting board, my pulse quickening. Martin was right upstairs, just a few steps away. You need to stop looking at me like that, I murmured under my breath. Like what? I glared at him, lowering my voice. Like that. You know exactly what I mean. Nick smirked, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long before he finally shrugged and moved to the fridge. He pulled out a soda and cracked it open, the sound far too loud in the quiet kitchen. What's with you today? I asked, trying to steer the conversation onto safer ground. Nick looked at me over the rim of the can, his expression suddenly serious. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I could feel it. Something was off. That night, Martin sat at the dining table with us, oblivious to the tension simmering just beneath the surface. He was talking about work, something about a deal he was trying to close, but I couldn't focus. I kept sneaking glances at Nick across the table, trying to read him, trying to figure out what was wrong. Finally, Martin's phone rang, and he excused himself to take the call in his office. The moment he was gone, the silence in the dining room grew deafening. What's going on with you? I whispered, my voice sharp. Nick pushed his plate away, leaning back in his chair as he looked at me. His calm, confident demeanor was gone, replaced by something darker. I ran into someone today, he said quietly. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? Someone who knows. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Knows what? Nick didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his expression hard. About us. The room spun around me. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. Who knows? He hesitated, as if debating whether or not to tell me. A guy I know from school, Adam. He said he saw us, last week in the garage. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The garage. I thought we'd been careful, but apparently we hadn't been careful enough. What did he say? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nick shrugged, though I could see the tension in his jaw. He didn't say much, just that he saw us and that he'd keep quiet, for now. For now? I echoed, my stomach twisting into knots. Nick looked me dead in the eye. He wants money. $5,000. I felt the blood drain from my face. What? He said if we don't pay, he'll tell Martin. I stared at him, my mind racing. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. This was my worst nightmare come to life. If Martin found out, if anyone found out, it would ruin everything. My marriage, my reputation, my life. Nick must have seen the panic on my face because he reached across the table, grabbing my hand. I'll take care of it, he said firmly. You don't have to worry about anything. But I did worry. I worried more than I ever had in my life. The next few days were unbearable. I could barely eat. I could barely sleep. Every time Martin spoke to me, every time he kissed my cheek or asked how my day was, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my guilt and fear. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. For Adam to show up at our front door. For Martin to confront me. For everything to come crashing down. Nick tried to reassure me, but even he seemed on edge. I caught him pacing in the backyard one afternoon, his phone in his hand, his expression dark and tense. Did you talk to him? I asked, my voice shaking. Nick looked up at me, his jaw tight. Yeah, he's not backing down. What are we gonna do? I'll handle it, Nick said again, but this time his voice was harder, colder. How? I pressed, panic creeping into my voice. We don't have $5,000 just lying around, and even if we did... I said I'll handle it, Nick snapped, cutting me off. I stared at him, stunned by the anger in his voice. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a long breath as he looked away. I'm sorry, he muttered. I didn't mean to yell. I don't know what to do yet, but I'll figure it out. For the first time since this all began, I realized just how far we'd fallen. How deep we were in over our heads. This wasn't a game anymore. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as Martin slept beside me. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the silence deafening. I thought about Nick. About what we'd done, about the mess we were in now. I had let this happen. I had let myself fall into something I couldn't control, and now it was spiraling out of control. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know if it could be fixed. All I knew was that things were about to get much, much worse. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every sound, every creak of the house sent me into a spiral of panic, convinced that Adam was outside, or worse, that Martin was on to us. I kept imagining him finding out everything, watching his face twist with betrayal. By morning, I felt like a ghost. I stumbled out of bed, the weight of guilt and fear dragging me down with every step. I found Nick in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, staring at his phone with a deep frown. Did you hear from him? I asked softly. Nick looked up at me, his face tense and tired. He's getting impatient. My stomach nodded. What does that mean? He texted me this morning. Nick turned the phone around so I could see the screen. The message from Adam was short, blunt. Tell her to get the money today. Or I'll go to her husband tonight. I'm serious. I felt sick. I gripped the back of one of the chairs to steady myself, my vision swimming. What are we going to do? Nick's jaw tightened. I'll deal with him. There was something about the way he said it, so calm, so cold, that made me pause. I looked at him, my heart pounding. Nick? What do you mean, deal with him? He didn't answer. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. Nick had left the house hours earlier, and I hadn't heard from him since. I paced the living room, chewing my nails, jumping every time my phone buzzed with a notification. When the front door finally opened, I spun around, my heart lurching in my chest. Nick stepped inside, his expression unreadable, his clothes slightly rumpled. Where have you been? I demanded, my voice trembling. Nick set his keys down on the table, avoiding my gaze. It's done. What's done? I talked to him, Nick said flatly. He's not gonna bother us anymore. Something about the way he said it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. What did you do? Nick looked at me then, his eyes dark and steady. I handled it. You're not answering me, I said, my voice rising with panic. What did you do? Nick sighed, running a hand through his hair. He's not gonna tell Martin. He's not gonna tell anyone. Just trust me. Trust him? How could I trust him when he wouldn't tell me what he'd done? That night, I could barely function. I moved through the house in a daze, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Nick was calm, too calm, as if none of this had ever happened. Meanwhile, I felt like I was drowning. After Martin went to bed, I cornered Nick in the hallway. You need to tell me what's going on, I hissed. He stared at me for a long moment before finally speaking. Adam's gone, he left town. Just like that? I demanded, incredulous. Nick shrugged. He got scared. He realized he was messing with the wrong people. I didn't believe him. Not for a second. But I didn't push it further. I couldn't. The thought of what Nick might have done, the lengths he might have gone to for me, was too much to bear. For a while, things went back to normal. Or as close to normal as they could get. Nick and I pulled away from each other, as if some unspoken agreement had been made. The bubble we'd been living in had burst, and neither of us knew how to put the pieces back together. Martin didn't suspect a thing. He went about his days as usual, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had unfolded around him. But I couldn't relax. I couldn't stop thinking about Adam, about what Nick had done to make him go away. Then the letter arrived. It was a Tuesday morning when I found it in the mailbox, an unmarked envelope with my name scrawled across the front in messy handwriting. My hands shook as I carried it inside, my mind racing. I tore it open, my breath catching as I unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. You think it's over? It's not. I know everything. You'll hear from me soon. I sank into the chair at the kitchen table, the note trembling in my hands. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I thought this nightmare was over. But it wasn't. Someone else knew. Someone else was watching. And they weren't going to let us get away with it. I didn't tell Nick about the letter right away. I didn't know how. He had already gone so far to protect me, to protect us, and I couldn't ask him to do more. Instead, I hid the letter in the back of my desk drawer and tried to pretend it didn't exist. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every time I left the house, I felt eyes on me. A car parked down the street that I didn't recognize, a figure in the corner of my vision that disappeared when I turned to look. It was paranoia, I told myself, just my mind playing tricks on me. Until it wasn't. It happened one night when I was alone in the house. Martin was out of town again, and Nick had gone to visit friends. I was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine when I heard it, a faint thud from somewhere upstairs. I froze, my blood running cold. Nick? I called out, even though I knew he wasn't home. Silence. My heart pounded as I set down my glass and stood up, every muscle in my body on edge. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy candlestick, and started up the stairs, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the windows. I crept toward the bedroom, my hands trembling. Then I saw it. The window in Martin's office was open, the curtain fluttering softly in the breeze. And on the desk was another letter, identical to the first. I dropped the candlestick, my hands shaking as I grabbed the note. You're not as careful as you think. I'm coming for you. A sound behind me made me whip around, my heart lurching into my throat. Nick was standing in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes locked on mine. What's wrong? I held up the letter, my voice breaking. Someone knows. Someone's been here. Nick's expression hardened as he stepped into the room, taking the note from my hands. He read it quickly, his jaw tightening. We need to leave, he said quietly. What? I whispered, my pulse racing. We can't stay here, Nick said, his voice calm but firm. It's not safe anymore. I stared at him, my mind spinning. Leave? Leave everything behind? My house, my marriage, my entire life? But as I looked at Nick, I realized I didn't have a choice. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now we were running out of time. The rain had been coming down in sheets all afternoon, drumming against the windows like a reminder of everything I'd neglected to do. The attic still needed organizing. The old tools in the shed were beginning to rust, and Philip's antique desk, heavy and imposing, remained where it had always been, in the corner of his office. I was 53, but on days like this, I felt much older. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something invisible for too long. It had been 5 years since Philip passed, but his presence lingered in the house, tucked into every corner like the scent of cedar that rose whenever I opened his closet. The truth was, I didn't know why I still lived here. The house was too big for one person, and the constant maintenance overwhelmed me. But leaving felt like abandoning him, like saying goodbye for good. and I wasn't ready for that. This afternoon, I had decided, against my better judgment, that the desk had to go. It had sat untouched for years, the drawers still filled with Philip's papers and pens, the faintest outline of his coffee cup permanently etched into the wood. It wasn't that I wanted to erase him. It was that I needed to reclaim some part of this house for myself. The problem was, the desk was heavy. Too heavy for me to move alone, no matter how much I pushed or pulled. I stood there, staring at the immovable object, the rain pattering on the window behind me. My hair, tied loosely at the nape of my neck, had begun to frizz in the damp air, and my arms ached from trying to lift something that clearly wasn't meant to budge. That's when I heard his voice. "Need some help?" I turned to see Grant standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He looked almost casual, but there was a slight tilt to his head, an edge of amusement in his expression. Grant was Philip's son from his first marriage, a man I had known for years but never really known at all. At 27, he had grown into someone I hardly recognized. Broad-shouldered, tall, with a quiet confidence that had replaced the restless energy I remembered from his younger years. "I didn't mean to bother you," I said, brushing a stray curl from my face. "I just thought I could handle it myself." He smirked, stepping further into the room. "Looks like the desk had other ideas." I couldn't help but laugh, despite myself. "Yeah, well, it always was stubborn." He glanced at the desk, then back at me. "Let me give you a hand." Before I could protest, he moved past me, crouching slightly to examine the base of the desk. The muscles in his arms flexed as he tested the weight, his hands gripping the wood with a familiarity that surprised me. "On 3?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. I nodded, positioning myself on the opposite side. 1, 2, 3. We lifted together, and for a moment, I thought it might actually work. The desk shifted, scraping slightly against the floorboards, but then I faltered, the strain too much for my arms. Grant adjusted immediately, stepping closer to take on more of the weight. His hands brushed against mine as he repositioned his grip, and I felt a jolt of something unexpected. Something that made me acutely aware of how close we were standing. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, concerned. "Fine," I said quickly, though my heart was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the desk. We managed to move the desk a few feet before setting it down again with a heavy thud. I stepped back, breathing hard, and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Thanks," I said, trying to sound casual. "I couldn't have done that without you." "No problem," he replied, leaning against the edge of the desk. His shirt was slightly damp from the rain outside, clinging to his chest in a way that made me look away, embarrassed by my own wandering thoughts. "You've been tackling a lot of projects lately," he said after a moment. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Just trying to stay busy, I guess." He nodded, but there was a weight to his gaze that made me feel like he could see right through me. "If you ever need anything," he said, "you can ask." His words were simple, but something about the way he said them made my stomach flutter. "Thank you, Grant," I said softly. He smiled then, a small, genuine curve of his lips, and for a fleeting moment, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The days after the desk incident passed quietly, but Grant's presence around the house had become a constant. It started small. He'd repair the squeaky cabinet door in the kitchen, or trim the hedges outside without me asking. I didn't mind. In fact, I found myself looking forward to hearing the low hum of his voice as he worked, or the way his laughter would occasionally drift in from the backyard when he called out a joke to no one in particular. One morning I came downstairs to find him standing in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in hand. He was barefoot, his hair still damp from the shower, and I froze for a moment, caught off guard by how natural he looked there, as though he belonged. "Morning," he said, his lips curling into an easy smile. "Morning," I replied, grabbing my own mug and pouring myself a cup. "Cream and sugar?" he asked, already reaching for the canister. I blinked. "How'd you know?" He shrugged, leaning against the counter. "I pay attention." There was something disarming about the way he said it, casual, but with an undertone that made my stomach flutter. I busied myself with stirring my coffee, focusing on the rhythmic clink of the spoon against the ceramic. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I think I'm getting the hang of this place. It's peaceful here, a nice change of pace." I glanced at him, curious. From what? Grant set his mug down, his expression turning serious. Work, the city. All of it, really. I was burning out. You never said much about your job, I said, leaning against the opposite counter. What was it like? Demanding, he replied, a wry smile tugging at his lips. I was in project management. Long hours, constant deadlines, people breathing down your neck. It paid well, but... He trailed off, shaking his head. It wasn't worth it. I needed to get out before it swallowed me whole. His honesty caught me off guard, and I found myself stepping closer, drawn in by the rawness of his words. That must have been a hard decision, I said softly. It was, he admitted. But coming here, it's been good for me. Better than I expected. Our eyes met then, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. I felt the warmth of his gaze, steady and unwavering, and my heart skipped a beat. That evening, I joined him in the backyard, where he'd been clearing out the overgrown flower beds. The sun was low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the grass. I brought out 2 glasses of lemonade and handed one to him as he wiped the sweat from his brow. You didn't have to do all this, I said, gesturing to the neatly trimmed hedges and freshly dug soil. I wanted to, he replied simply, taking a sip of his drink. This place deserves a little love, don't you think? I nodded, unable to argue. Philip would have appreciated it. Grant glanced at me, his expression softening. What about you? I blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? Do you appreciate it? He asked, his tone gentle but pointed. The question lingered in the air between us, and I realized I didn't have an answer. One Saturday morning, I found myself walking into the garage, looking for a hammer to fix a loose curtain rod. Grant was already there, crouched in front of Philip's old toolbox. He was sorting through the tools, his movements efficient and methodical. Need something? He asked without looking up. A hammer, I said, stepping closer. He handed it to me, his fingers brushing against mine in the exchange. The contact was brief, but it sent a spark up my arm. Thanks, I murmured, turning to leave. Wait, he said, standing. Let me help you. I hesitated, but before I could protest, he followed me into the living room. He made quick work of the curtain rod, his hands steady as he secured the brackets. I watched him from the doorway, noticing the way his shirt clung to his back as he reached up. There, he said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. Good as new. I smiled, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened when he turned to face me. You're handy to have around. He grinned, wiping his hands on his jeans. Glad I could help. For a moment we stood there, the silence between us heavy with something unspoken. That evening, the rain returned, a soft drizzle that tapped against the windows like a whisper. The power flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a few candles and made my way to the living room, where I found Grant sitting on the couch, his face illuminated by the soft, golden glow. Guess it's just us in the storm, he said, his voice low and warm. I smiled faintly, sitting down beside him. The rain created a cocoon of sound around us, isolating us from the rest of the world. Do you ever think about leaving this place? He asked suddenly. I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. Sometimes, I admitted, but it's hard to imagine where I'd go. This house, it's been my whole life for so long. Grant nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering candlelight. I get that, but you deserve more than this. His words hung in the air and I felt my throat tighten. More than what? More than being stuck here, holding on to memories, he said, turning to look at me. You're not just Philip's widow, Marina, you're so much more than that. I swallowed hard, unable to look away from him. His words were like a key, unlocking something inside me I hadn't realized was locked. Grant, I began, but my voice faltered. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was gentle, almost tentative, but it sent a shiver through me. I'm sorry, he said softly, pulling his hand back. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. You didn't, I whispered, my voice trembling. Our eyes met, and the air between us seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Slowly he leaned closer, his gaze dropping to my lips. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to stop him, to pull away. But I didn't. It happened the next day in the shed. I had spent the morning going through Philip's old things, sorting tools into neat piles, the smell of sawdust and motor oil hanging heavy in the air. The process should have been cathartic, but it wasn't. Instead, it dredged up old memories, leaving me raw and unsettled. By the time Grant appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag, I was on the verge of tears. "You've been at this all morning," he said, stepping inside. "Take a break." "I'm fine," I replied, though my voice cracked slightly. Grant frowned, setting the rag aside. "No, you're not." Before I could protest, he crouched beside me, his eyes scanning my face. "What's wrong?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I held up a small wooden box, the one I'd found buried beneath a pile of Philip's unfinished projects. "It was his," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He was working on it the week before he passed." Grant reached for the box, his fingers brushing mine. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting the half-sanded edges and the faint pencil marks where Philip had sketched out measurements. "He never got to finish it," I added, my throat tightening. Grant set the box down gently, his expression softening. "I'm sorry, Marina." His words, simple as they were, broke something inside me. The tears I'd been holding back spilled over, and I covered my face with my hands, ashamed of my own vulnerability. "Hey," Grant said softly, his hands settling on my shoulders. "It's okay." "I'm sorry," I choked out. "I don't mean to fall apart like this. It's hard, you know? Living with all of this, his things, his memories. Like they're frozen in time. And I'm stuck here, trying to keep it all together." Grant's grip on my shoulders tightened, his touch steady and grounding. "You don't have to keep it together all the time," he said. "It's okay to let yourself feel." I shook my head, fresh tears spilling down my cheeks. "I feel so guilty, like I'm betraying him just by thinking about moving on." Grant's thumbs brushed against my arms, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not betraying him, Marina. You're allowed to live. You're allowed to find happiness again." I looked up at him then, my vision blurry with tears. His face was so close, his expression so open and sincere, that it made my heart ache. "Grant," I began, but the words caught in my throat. He didn't hesitate. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on my cheeks, and kissed me. At first I froze, too stunned to respond. But then something inside me gave way, and I leaned into him, my hands gripping his arms for support. The kiss was gentle, tentative, but it sent a surge of warmth through me, melting away the cold, hollow ache I'd carried for so long. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads rested together, and I could feel his breath against my skin. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't help it." I shook my head, my hands trembling. "Don't apologize." We didn't talk much as we walked back to the house. The sun was beginning to set, casting the yard in a warm golden light, but all I could focus on was the way Grant's hand brushed against mine as we walked side by side. When we stepped inside, the house felt different, quieter, heavier. I glanced at Grant, unsure of what to say or do, but he seemed to sense my hesitation. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "I think so." He stepped closer, his gaze searching mine. "If you want me to leave." "Don't," I interrupted, surprising even myself. His eyes softened, and he reached for my hand, his fingers threading through mine. "Are you sure?" I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. But then I thought about the years I'd spent alone, the nights I'd lain awake in bed, aching for something I couldn't name. And I realized that for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone anymore. "I'm sure," I whispered. He led me upstairs, his hand warm and steady against the small of my back. My heart was racing as we stepped into my bedroom. But when he turned to face me, his expression was so tender, so full of care, that some of my nerves began to fade. "It's just us," he said softly, his hand settling on my waist. "Nothing else matters." I nodded, my breath hitching as he leaned in to kiss me again. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. His lips were warm and firm against mine, and his hands moved to cup my face, his thumbs brushing against my skin with a gentleness that made my heart ache. We moved together slowly, carefully, as though the moment might shatter if we moved too fast. He guided me to the bed, his hands steady as they slid over my arms, my shoulders, my waist. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as someone's widow, or as a woman weighed down by grief, but as myself. And as I lay there with him, his touch soft and reverent, I realized how much I'd missed this, the intimacy, the connection, the feeling of being wanted. When it was over, We lay tangled together in the soft light of the bedside lamp, the sound of our breathing filling the room. Grant's arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing slow, lazy circles on my hip. "I don't regret this," he said softly, breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening at the sincerity in his eyes. "I don't either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled then, a small, tender curve of his lips, and I felt something inside me shift. Something that felt a lot like hope. I woke before Grant the next morning. The early light filtered through the curtains, painting soft patterns across the bed. He lay beside me, one arm slung over his forehead, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. For a moment, I simply watched him, my thoughts a tangle of emotions. Part of me wanted to stay in this quiet, stolen moment forever, but another part, a louder, more rational part, reminded me of the lines we'd crossed. I slipped out of bed carefully, wrapping my robe around me as I moved to the window. The yard was still wet from yesterday's rain, the ground glistening in the sunlight. It should have been comforting, this familiar view, but it wasn't. It felt heavy. What had I done? The guilt crept in, sharp and unrelenting. This house, this life, it had all been Philip's, and I had spent years preserving it, keeping it exactly as he'd left it. And now, in the span of one night, I had disrupted everything. But even as the guilt gnawed at me, I couldn't ignore the warmth still lingering in my chest. For the first time in years, I had felt something other than grief. Something alive. Behind me I heard the soft rustle of sheets. "Marina?" I turned to see Grant sitting up in bed, his hair tousled, his expression half curious, half concerned. "You okay?" I nodded, though my throat felt tight. "Just thinking." "About last night?" he asked, his voice cautious. "Yes." He waited for me to say more, but when I didn't, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood. He crossed the room slowly, stopping just short of me. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said gently. "We'll figure it out, together." We spent the rest of the morning in a kind of fragile quiet. Over breakfast, the conversation stayed light. Small talk about the weather, plans for the day. But there was an unspoken understanding between us, a shared acknowledgement of what had changed. After Grant left to run errands, I found myself wandering back to the shed. The wooden box Philip had been working on sat on the workbench, its unfinished edges catching the light. I ran my fingers over the surface, the grain of the wood rough beneath my touch. I thought about Philip, his steady hands, his quiet laughter, the way he'd always known how to make me feel safe. And then I thought about Grant, the way he'd looked at me last night, not with pity or obligation, but with something real. The past and the present felt like two opposing forces, pulling me in different directions. But as I stood there in the quiet stillness of the shed, I realized I didn't have to choose between them. I could carry both. That evening, Grant surprised me with a gesture I hadn't expected. He had spent the afternoon fixing Philip's project, the wooden box now smooth, sanded, and polished to perfection. "I thought you might want to keep it," he said, handing it to me with a sheepish smile. I took the box carefully, my throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you," I said softly. His gaze met mine, steady and reassuring. "You're allowed to move forward, Marina. It doesn't mean you're forgetting him." I nodded, tears pricking my eyes. "I know." Later, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The future was uncertain, messy, and full of questions I couldn't yet answer. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. Grant reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. I squeezed his fingers lightly, a small smile tugging at my lips. The past would always be a part of me, but so would this moment. And for now, that was enough.